Authoritarian states are using cheap mass strike systems, energy leverage, and terror against civilian life as instruments of war. So Ukraine's not only fighting for its own survival, it's also generating the operational lessons the rest of the free world now urgently needs. The lesson for the West, America, and for America's partners in the Gulf is simple. Help Ukraine win. Learn from Ukraine's battlefield innovation and do not treat these conflicts as isolated, because they are interconnected fronts in a wider context and over security, coercion, and the rules of international order.
David Deptula is a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General. Welcome to our program, General Deptula.
Well, thanks very much, Daniel. It's good to be back on.
Let's begin our session with another Ukrainian drone strikes inside Russia. Ukraine launched its largest wave of drone attacks on Russia so far this year, between Tuesday, March 24th to Wednesday, March 25th, targeting Russia's Baltic Sea oil terminals in Primorsk and Ust-Luga. Analysts say that this has been the largest Ukrainian drone strike on Russia since the beginning of 2026. How do you read that, and what is your assessment of another huge blow to Russia's oil infrastructure?
Well, I think that Ukraine's recent strikes on Russian oil infrastructure are strategically significant because they go after the revenue base that sustains Russia's war. Primorsk is not a symbolic target. It's one of Russia's key Baltic export hubs for crude and fuel products. And reporting indicates that after the strike, there was a very large fire and tanker loadings were suspended, at least temporarily. Now that matters because even short disruptions can impose economic costs, it can complicate logistics, and it also signals that Russia's energy arteries are vulnerable. Now, I do think it is best understood that these attacks are part of a larger Ukrainian strategic attack plan. They're not just random strikes, but they're a deliberate effort to degrade the Russian infrastructure that funds aggression. And that's important. It's important in the context that Ukraine is trying to raise the cost of war for Moscow in the sector that matters the most to the Kremlin, and that's energy exports. And so in strategic terms, that is an entirely rational move. And I'd add that there's also a larger geopolitical angle. Because as you and your audience probably well know, if instability in the Gulf pushes global oil prices upward, Russia benefits from higher prices. So from Ukraine's perspective, striking Russian export infrastructure is one of the few tools available to offset that advantage and deny Moscow some of the financial windfall that's been created by the Iran crisis. So when Ukraine strikes Russian oil states, it's attacking the cash register of the Russian war.
Also, Sergei Shoigu, former Russia's defense minister and right now secretary of Russia's so-called National Security Council, recently said that no Russian region was safe from Ukrainian drone strikes. So according to Shoigu, there is not a single region, not even a single Russian region, which is safe right now completely due to Ukrainian drone attacks. And this seems to be a significant statement by a member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle, because Sergei Shoigu is also close friend of Vladimir Putin. What does this reveal, and what does this mean to hear such language from Russia's top official?
Well, I think it does exactly what you just said. It confirms the fact that Ukraine's strategic attack campaign is having an impact. There's probably not a better feedback mechanism than someone that is that high in Russia's defense architecture to confirm the impact of Ukraine's strikes. So it is something that those of us who have been advocates and practitioners of air warfare over the years, it's fundamental to the ability to impose strategic effects upon an adversary. And Ukraine is doing that with their creative use of long-range cruise missiles that some people call drones, but in fact, they really are cruise missiles, and putting the kind of pressure deep into Russia that needs to occur. And quite frankly, the friends and partners who would like to see Ukraine succeed need to increase their contributions to Ukraine to be able to have that kind of an impact.
Let's also cover global strategic picture of the war in Ukraine, because Russia's war against Ukraine has entered its 5th year. And also Russia's war against Ukraine has now lasted longer than Soviet Union's war against Nazi Germany. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, when he did launch this war against Ukraine in February 2022, this full-scale invasion, he aimed to reduce Ukraine's military, to degrade Ukrainian military capabilities. But right now it seems like Vladimir Putin has achieved an opposite success, but his decision to launch this full-scale war made Ukraine stronger. Ukraine right now plans to produce approximately 7 million drones per year, and also has its own Neptune missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, Flamingo missiles. How do you assess this opposite success of Vladimir Putin?
I think that first, you make some excellent points. This is not the easy objective that he originally envisioned. And the longer that it goes on, the more likely the realization by not just the Russian leadership, but the Russian people understand the folly of the aspirations of Putin. And so they are beginning to understand that they're not going to win this war. Matter of fact, that they are indeed losing it. And all you need to do is look at the impact on their economy and look at the increase in the resources that they are now forced to spend to continue their aggression against Ukraine. So unfortunately, it takes time for this message to sink in, but I think it's becoming more and more evident every day. And what needs to be done is the friends and partners of Ukraine need to continue to supply Ukraine with means to take the fight deeper and deeper into Russia. I think that the Russian leadership understands what's going to happen. Now, the trick in all of this is to work to ensure that that realization hits home to Putin such that he will terminate his aggression. That's no small task, and it's one of the challenges that increased pressure in terms of lethal application of force against Russia, against more of the strategic targets deep in Russia, will hopefully bring home to the Russian leadership and they'll come to the same kind of realization that they did when they were fighting in Afghanistan, that their aggression is no longer worth it to their own people. And when that realization occurs, then this war will ultimately stop.
From your perspective, can Vladimir Putin really end this war or accept ceasefire deal without reaching his strategic objectives? Can he sell this to Russian people?
Well, that's kind of what I was alluding to. That's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do to an authoritarian dictator like Putin, who doesn't think like we do. It is very difficult, and one of the challenges that we have is, putting ourselves into his mindset and thinking in the context of what could convince him to halt his aggression and back down from his extremist perspective. So I think a good part of that is, and this is difficult in a totalitarian state like Russia, if the people actually understood what was going on and there was free exchange of information, it wouldn't be as difficult as it is when you're operating in a state like Russia, where Putin and his cronies have total and complete control of information. So this is not an easy issue, but one that, quite frankly, the continued pressure on Russia is one way to continue to get this message across. And ultimately, it's going to take the people that surround Putin to convince him that it is in Russia's best interest to stop this aggression.
And how do you assess current stage of Ukraine-Russia-US negotiations, which have probably reached a stalemate right now?
Well, they have reached a stalemate. And the fact of the matter is that President Zelensky has indicated over and over and over again that he's willing to come to an agreement to halt hostilities, but the Russians continue with their intransigence in terms of not wanting to cooperate. And once again, I've said it before, others have said it over and over again, the only thing Putin understands is force. So force application needs to continue to occur, and quite frankly, increase on the kinds of critical strategic targets that we just talked about earlier in this presentation, and that is to hurt the Russian state where it matters most, and that's in their energy infrastructure.
Does Ukraine still need a US-made Tomahawk cruise missile? Because right now, Ukraine also has its own ballistic cruise missiles, and US President Donald Trump probably hesitates to make this decision, and probably there is no longer such discussions in the White House due to continued effort, US military effort in Iran.
Look, Tomahawks are another cruise missile that could be used effectively to put pressure on Russia. But what is it is another tool. It's not a silver bullet. There are no such things as silver bullets in an extensive war like Ukraine and Russia are engaged in. So, yeah, they'd be nice, but there have been over 500 Tomahawks expended in the Ukraine war, in the Iran war in the Middle East just over the last 3 weeks. So, there's an issue with respect to availability of those systems. So, quite frankly, Ukraine's doing the best thing that it can, and probably the most prudent thing that it's doing, and that's to increase production of the Flamingo and continue to use them against the kind of strategic targets that we discussed earlier.
Yesterday, on March 24th, Russia launched another full-scale drone and missile attacks against Ukraine, striking even Bernardin Monastery church in Ukraine's Lviv city center. This is a 16th century historic church, which is protected by UNESCO international organization. This was not military target, this was a civilian target, a religious place, place where people pray and try to connect with God and visit in civilian purpose, not a military one. How do you assess this attack in the middle of negotiations which still are going on in US? President Trump says that US continues this effort despite current focus on the Middle East.
Well, Daniel, the recent increase in attacks are a reminder that Russia continues to wage war not only against Ukrainian forces, but against Ukrainian society. It's absolutely appalling because the targets were not just military. As you mentioned, the UNESCO site in Lviv, the residential areas, the transport links, the energy-related infrastructure, all that was hit again. And what this largest 24-hour aerial strike of the war reflects is a deliberate shift toward time-phase saturation warfare, where the Russian attacks are designed not to overwhelm defenses in a single wave, but to exhaust, stretch, and degrade Ukraine's integrated air defense system over time. So this has been a very large, and as you mentioned, a combined barrage of drones and missiles across multiple regions, killing civilians and injuring dozens. And that's not incidental damage, as you highlight. It's part of a deliberate strategy of terror, coercion, and exhaustion aimed at breaking Ukraine's will and undermining daily life. So what Moscow wants is psychological effect as much as physical destruction. It wants Ukrainians to live with constant insecurity, and it wants Ukraine's partners to become accustomed to Russian atrocities. And so that's why the correct response is not fatigue or accommodation. The correct response is more air defense, more interceptor capability and capacity, more hardening of critical infrastructure, and increased pressure on the Russian war machine.
Also, let's cover and assess the performance of Ukraine defense, because yesterday, during this huge attack on Ukraine, on March 24th, Russia, we have official information from Ukrainian Air Force, Russia launched 556 drones, so more than 500 drones against Ukraine, and most of these drones were intercepted by Ukrainian air defense system. Only 15 Russian drones were not intercepted. This is probably great performance by Ukraine's Air Force. How do you read that?
Well, it is an excellent performance. And quite frankly, this is where Ukraine is now leading the world in the understanding of how to put together a multi-layered integrated air defense system to achieve such high intercept rates against the kinds of onslaughts that you're talking about. And it speaks to the innovation of the Ukrainian military and the backbone of the Ukrainian people in continuing to defend themselves against these attacks, which have become daily in nature and have expanded. But I think what it shows is that once again, Ukraine is not going to capitulate to Russian aggression, and it's becoming more and more evident that their capabilities to defend themselves, as well as take the fight to the Russians, are increasing and increasing dramatically, I might say.
Let's also cover US-Israeli war against Iran, this ongoing military effort, and also Ukraine's role in that, in helping better defend Gulf nation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has sent more than 200 probably military experts to the Gulf nation to help them to better protect these nations against Iranian Shahed drones. Also, we have tracked some cargo flights from Poland to the Middle East. We don't know whether this is about transferring of Ukraine's drone interceptors, but this is cooperation which still is going on right now between Ukraine, Middle East countries, and also Ukraine has proposed his help to US allies and to United States. From your perspective, how significant could Ukraine contribute to this defense of Gulf nations, and has US military properly prepared for this war, taking into account drone warfare and drone protection? How can you assess performance of US military? There have been some reports that US and its allies used such costly interceptors like Patriot systems to intercept cheap Iranian drones.
Obviously, there are some very significant lessons that can be learned, and absolutely Ukraine can help understand some of the not just defensive but other means that can be used to deal with these kinds of issues. Because frankly, Ukraine has more practical experience against Iranian drones or unmanned aerial vehicles that in reality are cruise missiles than any other country in the world. Ukrainian forces innovated under fire, using layered defenses, electronic warfare, mobile fire groups, low-cost interceptors, and increasingly missile-on-missile solutions or drone-on-drone solutions. These are precisely the kinds of lessons that the Gulf states and even the United States, as you indicated, need when facing large volume, low-cost aerial attacks. And as you mentioned, President Zelensky's already sent experts to the Gulf to help partners defend against Shahed-type attacks in the Middle East. Now, that's a remarkable development because Ukraine's not only a recipient of security assistance, it's now becoming an exporter of battlefield knowledge. The broader point is that low-cost, precision-guided munitions in the form of quadcopters with explosives and low-cost cruise missiles are changing the economics of defense. If you're firing very expensive interceptors against very cheap, mass-produced attack drones, you're on the wrong side of the cost curve. So Ukraine's wartime innovation matters because it's focused on affordable, scalable means of detection, disruption, and interception. And that experience has strategic value well beyond Europe. Ukraine has paid for this expertise in blood. And that is tragic, but it also means that Ukraine now holds the world's most relevant knowledge about how to defeat drone attacks. And many could learn from that, including the American military. Now, there are two parts to this equation. It's not just about defense. And the part where the United States and Israel has shown the value of its advanced capabilities are in what we call offensive counter-air attacks. And that is the best way to deal with an adversary launching weapons at you is to prevent them from launching the weapons in the first place. So that's why you've seen these deep attacks into Iran that have been accomplished using advanced aircraft like the F-35 can penetrate contested airspace and attack their missile launch sites, their missile production sites, so they can't produce them in the future, and their missile storage sites. And so if you look at a graph of the number of ballistic missiles as well as Shahed drones that have been launched by Iran over time, they have dramatically been reduced, upwards of 80 and 90%. Yeah, they're still shooting some, but that's where the defensive part comes into play. And they're hidden, but with proper intelligence, we'll hunt those down and eliminate them too. So there are two parts to this equation. And I'm sorry to get this detailed, but this is extraordinarily important, particularly when we look at potential aggression from countries like China in the South China Sea. They cannot be allowed to launch their volleys of missiles if, in fact, they force the United States into responding to their aggression. They need to understand, and this is part of the deterrent equation, that they won't be allowed to launch those volleys of missiles because those will be attacked before they can be launched. So there are two parts of the equation here. There's an offensive counter-air piece, and there's a defensive piece. And Ukraine can certainly contribute to the defensive piece. And the United States of America is world-renowned for conducting offensive counter-air operations that we saw so effectively in the first Gulf War that we just celebrated the 35th anniversary of, as well as what you see ongoing in Iran today. So pardon me for the long, complex answer, but it's an important topic.
Let's also focus more on this U.S. and Israel war effort against Iran. Is U.S. winning this war against Iran from your perspective? Because there have been lots of discussion about this.
Yeah, look, all of this, the answer to your question goes back to what are the stated objectives? Okay, and the declared stated objectives on the part of the U.S. leadership, I'm not speaking for Israel here, but on the part of the U.S. leadership was to degrade and ultimately destroy Iran's ability to project power through the use of long-range missiles. That was number one. Number two was to destroy their Navy and their Air Force. And number three was to prevent them from acquiring a nuclear weapon. So those are the stated objectives. And if you look at progress with respect to the first two, the accomplishment of those objectives has been proceeding extraordinarily well. With respect to the prevention of acquiring nuclear weapon, once again, progress has been accomplished toward that goal, but ultimately that will only be satisfied when that refined uranium is under control of an international organization. So, we have to be, look, there's lots of people out there that have opinions about this or that or the other thing, but they all have to go back to what were the declared objectives and how is progress being measured, or what is the measure of progress in accomplishing those particular objectives. So I believe that the United States is on track to accomplish its declared objectives, as is Israel in accomplishing theirs.
Why can't U.S. unblock the Strait of Hormuz, and can they do this without deploying ground forces?
Yeah, they can do it without deploying ground forces. There is this mythology that the straits are closed. The straits aren't closed. There's shipping traffic that's moving through there. The real determinant of how much shipping goes through there are the owners of the ships and the insurance companies for that shipping, and their determination of what level of risk do they want to incur, they want to incur for letting ships go through there. Look, we now have the ability to provide 24/7 surveillance over that region, those regions that are adjacent to the Gulf. And what you're going to see unfold is a system where that observation using uninhabited aerial vehicles like the MQ-9 Reaper watch the Iranians pop up, and as soon as they pop up, they're engaged with lethal force to take out their ability to continue to launch weapons against any shipping. So the Strait will return to shipping that occurred in normal shipping that occurred before this conflict erupted. It will take some time, but at the end of in the hostilities, we're going to own the Gulf. The Iranians will not.
From your perspective, last question for you: how close are we to any kind of a deal between U.S. and Iran?
That's really difficult to tell because I don't have insights into, once again, we're dealing with an authoritarian, theocratic regime who does not think or deal with people in the way that Western personalities operate or think about. So it's extraordinarily difficult to tell. Any reading of history, if you go back and you look at how the Iranians negotiate, they lie through their teeth. You can't trust them to do anything. And so that's why you see this continued application of force, because at some point in time, they're going to realize they simply do not have the capability to protect themselves anymore, and they'll be forced into a solution one way or the other.
And most final question, U.S. has achieved probably air superiority over Iran. How did they manage to do so? By destroying all Iranians' air defense systems? Or were they even properly operated by Iran? I mean, this Russia's S-300, S-400 air defense systems.
Well, look, that campaign to achieve air superiority started last summer with the 12-day operation that Israel conducted against Iran. And part of the reason they were so successful back then is because they had a fifth-generation aircraft like the F-35 that could penetrate the integrated air defense system of Iran, which was populated with advanced Russian-built surface-to-air missile systems like the S-400. But you can see what happened. The combination of the lethality, the sensing capability, and the integration of all that information that's resident on board the F-35 was able to negate those weapon systems, then engage them and work with other elements to essentially take apart their integrated air defense system, that then allowed for air superiority, leading to air supremacy, such that just the other day we saw now B-52s actually flying over Iran, delivering precision-guided weapons, stand-in precision-guided weapons, not standoff weapons. So, look, you don't win wars with just air superiority, but what air superiority provides is the environment from which other forces can now put continual pressure on an adversary. Now, I know we're running close on time, but let me finish with this point that I'd like to make. All the issues that we've discussed today are connected. Russia's strikes on Ukrainian civilians, Iran's UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, drone, whatever you want to call them, attacks, and Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil infrastructure are all part of one strategic picture. Authoritarian states are using cheap mass strike systems, energy leverage, and terror against civilian life as instruments of war. So Ukraine's not only fighting for its own survival, it's also generating the operational lessons the rest of the free world now urgently needs. The lesson for the West, America, and for America's partners in the Gulf is simple. help Ukraine win. Learn from Ukraine's battlefield innovation and do not treat these conflicts as isolated, because they are interconnected fronts in a wider context and over security, coercion, and the rules of international order.
Thank you, General Deptula, for your insightful answers and great analysis, and glory to Ukraine.
Thanks very much, Daniel. It was great to be with you today.